At this time, the speaker for today's webinar will be addressing your questions and comments. Please submit your questions using the chat feature in WebEx. Questions are being compiled, and Douglas will address as many as time will allow. And I'll see if we have.
And then somewhere down the road, you can send me all the other questions. I'm happy to answer by email any questions people have.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So, yeah, please go ahead and start submitting your questions. But in the meantime, I wanted to come back around to your equations that you had put up. I want to make sure I'm understanding correctly. You were using some of those assumptions about body weight. I mean, you acknowledge there are the assumptions about body weight and ingestion rate that go into the calculation of an RFD. But in your methodology, somehow you are removing those assumptions? Because for some of us here, we're very concerned about early life exposures to contaminants, by, inhalation or ingestion, but in particular in drinking water. And there's a enormous effort here at EPA to look at what are the more appropriate assumptions about ingestion for children, using the right assumptions about their body weight, et cetera. And so I just want to make sure, wanting to get your reaction to how do you address sort of this issue about early life exposure, and how does that relate to the work you just described?
Okay, so at the heart of what I'll keep saying what I did, but actually again it's the Jacob Stratus and other team members and so forth. So it's really our product, but I'm the one talking today. At the heart of what we did was we said, look, if we've got hundreds of compounds, thousands of compounds that have got to be addressed in our methodology, we need a relatively simple way to get at this measure of toxicity. And so one begins to look for any big databases that allow us to go in and very quickly get these numerical values. And we decided early on that IRIS is a world-renowned resource. I mean, it's a very good database. But within IRIS, what one finds is things like the RFDs and so forth. Now, therefore, in order for us to use this massive database, we are restricted to whatever is the RFD that's reported in there and whatever was the drinking water rate and the body weight assumption that went into the creation of that RFD. And so we are stripping those out because what we actually want, remember the exposure is in micrograms or milligrams per liter, and the toxicity therefore is in units of inverse milligrams per liter. An RFD is not in milligrams per liter, right? An RFD is in milligrams per kilogram per day. So in order to get it over to the milligrams per liter, you have to look at how it was that the RFD was calculated and what liters per day and what body weight was used in there. If the EPA is worried about, which you should be worried about, early age exposure and so forth, then either one of two things have got to happen. Either you've got to go back in and you've got to force the RFD in IRIS to be reflective of that sensitive subpopulation. And when that happens, by the way, in IRIS, we do use whatever was the body weight and the drinking water rate that was applied there. But at the moment, this sort of 2 liters per day, 50 kilogram thing drives the majority of the RFD calculation. So I like the idea of using whatever is the critical sensitive subpopulation, but in our methodology, we have to use whatever was the basis for the RFD in the IRIS database.
Okay. Oh, great. Thank you so much. All right, we have a number of questions coming in. So here's one. Some criticisms have been leveled against QALYs and DALYs for growing, I guess, too close to economic evaluation of life. I mean, there has been a number of controversies around that. How do you put a value on human life? Have you had to deal with any criticisms like this in using this approach to a common metric?
Yes. Okay, I'll say that in two ways. Number one, yes, in my own mind, I am a critic of these things. Doesn't mean I won't go with them. It's that I understand that there are these sorts of, as the writer said, there are these legitimate concerns about whether one can put a value on life. Now, notice, by the way, that though we're not putting an economic value on it. That's not what a daily is. A daily is a public health person, an MD, saying, here's how important this effect is to the quality of the life of the individual. But nonetheless, there are, as I mentioned, legitimate concerns for that, but always decision-making is, choosing the best of the worst of the, if you saw Argo, is this the best of the worst options that we've got on the table? And so if one is going towards a cumulative risk which requires commensurability, you have to use something, and I would argue that a daily is no worse than a quali, is no worse than something like the World Health Organization, remember, critical effect, or doesn't put you in hospital or does put you in hospital. It's no better or worse than those, but if you don't buy any of that argumentation, then what you could say is, well, you know what, I'm going to do what we do currently in risk assessment and not try to reduce things down to commensurable units, and I'll just leave it up to the decision maker to use their discretionary power to do whatever it is that humans seem to do in making decisions. I think I would worry about that not leading to a cost-effective solution, and I hope that I made the argument that there are significant public health implications of having a less than optimal cost effectiveness, but I can't answer the question in any other way than to say I'm as torn as everybody else is on the critique. I would just say again, yes, you can critique it, but give me your alternative. That's not a challenge for the writer. Yeah.
Great. I have another question for you. A person commented that they were having a little bit of difficulty understanding a statement you had made regarding, quote, I think, no difference between cancer and non-cancer risk, I'm doing air quotes, when we do not have threshold numbers for cancer. Could you please elaborate?
Yes. The history of the regulatory approach, and of course, I'm singing inside the church here, given the audience that we've got here. The history of the regulatory approach is that when it came to non-cancer effects, this came from the old industrial hygiene approach, 1920s, 1930s, and the idea being that for every compound or every exposure, there was an actual threshold, right? And so the whole regulatory approach became, well, just don't go near that threshold. Stay below that threshold. Now, if one moves to a distributed threshold model, we know that individuals don't have even if there is a threshold, they don't have the same threshold. If you move to a distributed threshold model, what you get is not necessarily a monotonic curve, but you get a smooth curve of exposure on the one axis versus fraction of people, not probability, but fraction of people with the effect. So the argument that I'm making here, and I can understand why people might say, well, I'm not sure I'm buying this, Doug, but the argument I'm making here is that we treated cancer as if it was probabilistic. I think we treated it that way because cancer was dealt with at a time, or the regulatory approach of cancer was dealt with at the time when people were looking at things like radiation effects, and I'm a physicist and I'm responsible as much as anybody for bringing in these probabilistic ideas from physics. So we developed this sort of framework that says cancer is probabilistic, that there's no threshold for it, that one tries to regulate based on the probability of developing cancer. And my argument is that there's no biological reason why cancer can't be a threshold. It can, in fact, be, and it can, in fact, be a hormetic kind of a U-shaped phenomenon. And there's also no reason why non-cancer effects actually have thresholds to them. I mean, I know that historically we've done it, and just because we have a curve that seems to be plunging towards zero on the dose-response axis doesn't necessarily, in other words, coming down vertically, doesn't necessarily mean that there is in fact a threshold. It just means that we disappear down into the noise. So inherent in our methodology is this idea that we don't have to talk about, with a distributed threshold model, we don't have to talk about a distinct separation between the two approaches. But if you believe that cancer is a probabilistic event, and if you believe that non-cancer effects are threshold effects, then our methodology it's not for you. Doesn't mean your approach is wrong. This is just not the right methodology for you to use.
All right, I have another question for you, statement here. The MCLs reflect both health and feasibility of obtaining a certain level of the contaminant in drinking water. Could not the variability not be rising from technological limitations and not variability in health attributes? Why not use the MCLG?
Yeah. I love that. And in fact, in the paper that we finally published, I ended up using the MCLG and then forgot to label it as MCLG. So I agree with that. What we found was that in about 15% of the compounds, it was those technological limitation issues that were driving the MCL that we took a look at. And so all I'm going to say is, guilty is charged. In our most recent paper, we've taken care of that problem, but in the figures that I just showed you, I managed to go out and grab the ones that were associated with MCLGs and with MCLs. And if you instead use the MCLG, the amount of variation goes down by a factor of 4 in the graphs that I showed you. So good point.
Okay, great. Another comment to share with you. Interpretation of margin of safety is not the interpretation EPA uses. The latter focuses more on, I guess, conversion and scaling issues for equitoxic dose. Actual margin of safety, I think of, or if essential estimates of the dose conversions are believed, I guess, is much lower. Is that making sense?
Yeah, no, I know exactly where they're coming from, because in all the Science Advisory Board panels that you mentioned that I was on, we always had this discussion, which was the discussion of what does margin of safety actually mean? Not what does margin of safety mean in the legal terminology that's in the policy field, but what does it actually come out as if one frames this as a decision problem and a science problem. And I agree that there are many within the EPA who interpret margin of safety in exactly the way that the writer just said, right? On the Science Advisory Board deliberations, we were always arguing back with the EPA staff that, we're not sure we necessarily buy that interpretation of what a margin of safety actually means if you formulate this as like I say, a decision problem with probability density functions and so forth with uncertainty and variability. So if you buy the definition that is really the sort of standard definition of margin of safety and interpretation within the EPA, then I absolutely 100% agree with what the writer has said. I'll qualify my statements by simply saying this is the way I think you can actually philosophically describe what the margin of safety actually is as a practice, but I fully understand that there's not agreement in the crazy Crawford-Brown interpretation of margin of safety.
Okay, and I'm going to just take one more question here, or comment. It says here, economics is often not subjected to rigorous science in the way toxicological work is. It is important to note that costs are not allocated across a population for environmental justice concerns. This person would like to ask this question: who bears the cost in such a situation, and who gets the benefits? Wow, this is a very philosophical question.
Although yes, it's philosophical, but let me say it is also at exactly the heart of the kind of question the EPA ought to be asking, because the writer is absolutely right that cost-benefit analysis it simply doesn't really ask cost to whom, benefit to whom. And so within our group, that our Jacob/Stratus/others group, I was always coming back with exactly that sort of rejoinder that the writer is saying. And so I think perfectly legitimate point that's being made, perfectly legitimate point that we have methods of testing in many areas of science that we don't necessarily apply in economics, but a lot of what goes on in scientific toxicity testing is done in economics also. So I will defend economists in that sense, but it's not done as well as it is done in human health risk assessment. But again, I would say that I'm coming from human health risk assessment, not economics. I'll finally defend myself by saying, while I mentioned cost-benefit analysis, notice that nothing that I gave in terms of results of the cumulative risk assessment had any cost-benefit calculation in it anywhere. It did have a total public health impact measure in there, but I quite specifically and quite deliberately stayed away from calculating any economic impact. And disability-adjusted life years, I can't emphasize this enough, is not an economic measure. It's a public health measure of impact, and it was developed by public health practitioners, not by economists.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This concludes our webinar. Thank you again so much, Douglas, for presenting. I want to point out to everyone that an archive recording of today's webinar will be posted on NSER's website. I also want to point out, I noticed there were a couple of comments about getting access to background materials that inform this presentation today. I do want to point out on the NSER webpage, if you go to the overview of the CRA 2013 webinar series, we do include links to background materials that Douglas provided to us, so you guys can go look there. And then I wanted just to announce that our next webinar will be held on Wednesday, April 17th at 3 p.m. and will feature a presentation by one of our STAR grantees, Dr. Jonathan Levy, who is Professor of Environmental Health at Boston University School of Public Health, and the title of his webinar is Simulating Population Characteristics and Exposures to Multiple Stressors for a Community-Based Cumulative Risk Assessment. So as a reminder, just want to let you know, you all will be receiving an email invitation to complete the online survey about today's webinar. Your feedback provides us with valuable insight into how we might improve our logistics, potential discussion topics, and continuing to ensure that our webinars best fit your informational needs. Once again, thank you, Douglas, and thank you all for your participation today. Have a good afternoon, or good evening to Doug.